It was just a school photo from 1895, but historians noticed that one of them shouldn't be there. The basement of the Brooklyn Historical Society smelled of old paper and dust. Dr. James Morrison had been digitizing photographs from local schools for 3 months, scanning image after image of stern-faced children in Victorian-era clothing. Most were unremarkable. Standard class photos from the late 1800s preserved more out of institutional obligation than historical significance. It was a Thursday afternoon in March 2019 when he loaded the Riverside Elementary School collection onto his scanner. The building itself had been demolished in 1962, replaced by a parking lot, but its records had survived in cardboard boxes, forgotten in storage for decades. James adjusted his glasses and examined the screen. The photograph showed 42 children arranged in 4 neat rows on the school's front steps. The girls wore high-necked white blouses and dark skirts. The boys were dressed in wool suits with stiff collars. In the center stood a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with kind eyes and auburn hair pulled back severely, presumably the teacher. The image quality was surprisingly good for 1895. He could make out individual faces, the texture of the brick wall behind them, even the grain of the wooden steps. James zoomed in, preparing to catalog the photo with the others. That's when he saw it. On the far right edge of the photograph, partially obscured by 2 taller boys in the back row, was something that made him lean closer to the screen. A small arm extended from behind the children, the hand resting gently on the shoulder of the boy in front. But the skin tone was unmistakably darker than every other child in the photograph. James sat back, his heart beating faster. He zoomed in further, enhancing the image resolution. The hand belonged to a child, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, judging by the size. The fingers were small, delicate, but only the arm from elbow to fingertips was visible. The rest of the child's body was completely hidden behind the other students. He checked the photo's documentation. Riverside Elementary School, class of 1895, Brooklyn, New York. Teacher, Margaret Sullivan. James knew Brooklyn's history well. In 1895, segregation wasn't just social practice. It was enforced by law and custom. Black children were forbidden from attending white schools. They had separate, underfunded institutions, if they had access to education at all. So why was there a black child's arm in this photograph? He printed the image and stared at it under his desk lamp. The positioning seemed deliberate. The 2 taller boys in the back row stood unusually close together, their bodies creating a barrier that concealed everything except that one extended arm. Someone had hidden this child in plain sight. James couldn't sleep that night. The image haunted him. And that small brown hand resting on another child's shoulder, a gesture so natural and yet so forbidden in 1895 Brooklyn. He arrived at the Historical Society at dawn before the building officially opened, and went straight to the archive room. The Riverside Elementary records filled 3 large boxes. James pulled them out carefully, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. Inside were attendance ledgers, financial records, and correspondence dating from 1887 to 1915. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and smelled of mildew. He started with the 1895 attendance book. The names were written in elegant cursive. William Patterson, age 11. Catherine O'Brien, age 9. But Thomas Brennan, age 10. He counted 42 names total, exactly matching the number of visible children in the photograph. No Samuel, no black child listed anywhere. James moved to the financial records, hoping to find tuition payments or supply purchases that might indicate an additional student. Nothing. The school's budget accounted for exactly 42 students that year. Then he found something interesting. A personal letter tucked between the pages of a budget report. It was dated October 15th, 1895, and addressed to Margaret Sullivan from someone named Robert Sullivan. James carefully unfolded the fragile paper. "Dear sister," it began, "I received your letter regarding your concerns about the school. I must urge you to reconsider this dangerous path you've chosen. The laws are clear, and the consequences for violating them are severe. You risk not only your position, but your safety and reputation. I understand your compassion, but you must think practically. This is not a battle you can win." James read the letter 3 times. Margaret Sullivan had a brother who was warning her about something dangerous she was doing at the school, something that violated the law, something that required compassion over practicality. He photographed the letter with his phone and continued searching. 2 hours later, he found another document, a complaint filed with the school board in November 1895 by a parent named Mr. Harold Jenkins. The handwriting was aggressive, the words underlined for emphasis. "It has come to my attention that Miss Sullivan may be providing instruction to a colored child in violation of state education laws. While I have no direct proof, I have heard rumors from my son that an additional child has been seen in the classroom after regular hours. I demand an immediate investigation into this matter." The school board's response was attached. Matter investigated. No evidence found. Miss Sullivan's conduct deemed appropriate. Case closed. James sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Margaret Sullivan had been teaching a black child secretly. The school board had investigated but found nothing, probably because she'd hidden the evidence well. And that photograph? It wasn't a mistake. It was an act of quiet defiance. That hidden arm wasn't an accident. It was proof. James spent the next week tracking down everything he could find about Margaret Sullivan. The Brooklyn Public Library had birth and death records, census data, and old city directories that painted a picture of her life. She was born in 1868 in Brooklyn to Irish immigrant parents. Her father had been a dock worker who died in an accident when Margaret was 12. Her mother took in laundry to support the family. Margaret had 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister. According to the 1890 census, she was listed as a school teacher, unmarried, living with her mother in a modest apartment on Atlantic Avenue. What struck James most was a newspaper clipping he found from 1896. It was a small article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, barely 3 inches long, titled, "Teacher Resigns After Controversy." Miss Margaret Sullivan, instructor at Riverside Elementary School, has resigned her position effective immediately. School Board Chairman Mr. Edward Whitmore stated that Miss Sullivan's departure was voluntary and wished her well in future endeavors. Miss Sullivan declined to comment. The timing was significant. The complaint had been filed in November 1895. The photograph was taken in September 1895, and Margaret resigned just a few months later in early 1896. James found her name in subsequent census records. In 1900, she was listed as a private tutor, living in the same apartment with her aging mother. By 1910, she was working as a seamstress. She never married. She died in 1943 at age 75 and was buried in Greenwood Cemetery. The trajectory of her life suggested someone who had been pushed out of her profession, someone who had sacrificed her career for something she believed in. But who was the child? Who was Samuel? James went back to the photograph, examining every detail. He noticed something he'd missed before, the boy whose shoulder the hidden hand was resting on. He was smaller than the others in the back row, with dark hair and a serious expression. James checked the attendance ledger again. The boy's name was Patrick Murphy, age 9. On impulse, James searched for Patrick Murphy in later records. He found him in the 1900 census, age 14, listed as living with his parents and working as a delivery boy. In 1910, he was a carpenter. In 1920, married with 3 children. And in 1918, Patrick Murphy had registered for the World War I draft. The registration card included his full address and, interestingly, an emergency contact, his mother, Mrs. Mary Murphy, and a note that said, "In case of death, notify also Mr. Samuel Carter, 447 DeKalb Avenue, Brooklyn." Samuel Carter. DeKalb Avenue was in a historically black neighborhood. James felt his pulse quicken. This was the connection he'd been looking for. DeKalb Avenue in 1895 was part of a small but vibrant black community in Brooklyn. James spent days in the library researching the area, reading through church records, burial registries, and old neighborhood directories. The black population in Brooklyn was small then, less than 2% of the total, but they'd built their own institutions, churches, mutual aid societies, small businesses. James found Samuel Carter listed in the 1900 census. Age 14, living with his grandmother, Alice Carter, who worked as a domestic servant. His parents weren't listed, likely deceased. The address was indeed 447 DeKalb Avenue, a building that no longer existed. But what fascinated James was what he found in the records of the Bridge Street African Methodist Episcopal Church, just 3 blocks from DeKalb Avenue. The church had kept meticulous records, and buried in their archive was a small notation from 1895. Young Samuel Carter, age 9, has shown exceptional aptitude for reading and mathematics. His grandmother seeks educational opportunities beyond what our Sunday school can provide. Prayers requested for guidance in this matter. James contacted the church, which was still active, and spoke with Reverend Thomas Green, an elderly man who had spent 40 years studying the congregation's history. They met in the church basement, surrounded by boxes of old documents. "Samuel Carter," Reverend Green said, nodding slowly. "I've seen that name." His grandmother, Alice, was a remarkable woman. Widowed young, worked her whole life cleaning houses for white families in Brooklyn Heights. She was determined that Samuel would have an education. "Do you know anything about him attending Riverside Elementary?" James asked carefully. Reverend Green's eyes sharpened. "That's an interesting question. There were always rumors, stories passed down, about certain white teachers who would secretly tutor black children. It was dangerous for everyone involved. The teachers could lose their jobs and face legal consequences. The families could be harassed or worse." He pulled out a worn leather journal. "This belonged to one of our deacons from that era. He kept notes about the community." He flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for. "Here, March 1896. Alice Carter's grandson will no longer receive special instruction. The arrangement has ended. Alice is heartbroken but grateful for what was provided." "March 1896, James repeated. "That's when Margaret Sullivan resigned." Reverend Green nodded. "It sounds like someone found out and the teacher had to stop before things got worse. These were dangerous times." James knew he needed more evidence. He needed to find descendants of the people involved, someone who might have family stories or documents passed down through generations. He started with Patrick Murphy, the boy whose shoulder Samuel's hand had rested on in the photograph. Through genealogy websites and public records, James traced Patrick's line. He'd had 3 children, and one of them, a daughter named Catherine, had lived until 2007. She'd had 2 sons, one of whom, David Murphy, was still alive and living in New Jersey. James sent a carefully worded email explaining his research and asking if David would be willing to talk. 3 days later, his phone rang. "This is David Murphy," the voice said. "You asked about my great-grandfather Patrick. I might have something that interests you." They met at a coffee shop in Montclair the following Saturday. David was a retired accountant in his 70s with white hair and sharp blue eyes. He carried a small wooden box. "My great-grandfather Patrick died before I was born," David explained, "but my grandmother Catherine used to tell us stories about him. She said he was a quiet man, deeply religious, and that he'd carried a secret his whole life, something he'd made her promise never to forget." David opened the box. Inside was a faded photograph. Not the school photo, but a different image entirely. It showed 2 boys, perhaps 10 years old, standing side by side in front of a brick wall. One was white, the other black. They had their arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling at the camera. James's breath caught. "Is this Patrick and Samuel?" David confirmed. "Taken in 1896, according to the note on the back." He turned the photo over. In careful handwriting, it said, "Patrick Murphy and Samuel Carter. Friends forever, September 1896. "How did they meet?" James asked. David pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. A letter written in shaky handwriting, dated 1954. "This is from my grandmother Catherine. She wrote down everything Patrick told her before he died. He wanted the story preserved." James read aloud. "Miss Sullivan was the kindest teacher I ever knew. In 1894, when I was 8, she started staying late after school to help me with reading because I was struggling. One day, I arrived early and found her teaching another boy, Samuel. He was colored, which was forbidden, but Miss Sullivan said God didn't make laws about who deserved to learn. She asked if I would keep the secret. I did. Samuel and I became friends. We'd study together after the other children left. For almost 2 years, we learned side by side. When the school board investigated, Miss Sullivan hid all evidence. She even arranged for Samuel to be in the class photo, hidden behind us taller boys so only his arm showed. It was her way of saying he belonged, even if the world disagreed. When she was forced to resign, it broke my heart. Samuel and I stayed friends in secret for years after." James looked up, his eyes wet. "This is extraordinary." David nodded. "Patrick never forgot Samuel or Miss Sullivan. He said they taught him that courage sometimes means doing what's right even when the law says it's wrong." With Patrick's testimony documented, James turned his attention to finding Samuel's descendants. The trail was harder to follow. Black families' records from that era were often incomplete or lost, but through church records, census data, and help from genealogists specializing in African American history, he found a lead. Samuel Carter had married in 1908 to a woman named Ruth Jenkins. They'd had 4 children. One of them, a son named William, had a daughter named Dorothy who was still alive, 93 years old, living in a nursing home in Queens. James called the facility and explained his research. The administrator was cautious, but agreed to ask Dorothy if she'd be willing to meet. 2 days later, James received a call. "Ms. Dorothy says she's been waiting 70 years for someone to ask about her grandfather," the administrator said. "She'll see you tomorrow." Dorothy Carter sat in a wheelchair by the window of her room, a thin woman with silver hair and eyes that were still sharp and bright. The walls were covered with family photographs. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. "You want to know about Grandpa Samuel," she said without preamble. "Sit down, I'll tell you what he told me." James sat, his recorder ready. "Grandpa Samuel was born in 1886, Dorothy began. His parents died of tuberculosis when he was 6. His grandmother, Alice, raised him alone. She worked as a maid for wealthy families in Brooklyn Heights. She cleaned their houses, washed their clothes, cooked their meals, and every night, no matter how tired she was, she'd sit with Samuel and teach him to read, using a Bible she'd saved for years to buy." Dorothy's voice grew softer. "Grandma Alice had a dream. She wanted Samuel to become a teacher someday. But black children weren't allowed in white schools, and the colored schools were overcrowded and underfunded. She prayed for a miracle. The miracle came in the form of Miss Margaret Sullivan. Grandma Alice worked for a family that lived near Riverside Elementary. One day, Miss Sullivan saw Grandma Alice teaching Samuel to read on a park bench during her lunch break. Instead of walking past, Miss Sullivan sat down and listened. Then she asked if Samuel would like real lessons. James leaned forward. "What did Alice say?" "She was terrified," Dorothy replied. "She knew it was illegal. She knew they could both get in serious trouble, but Miss Sullivan promised to be careful. She said every child deserved an education, and she'd find a way to make it work." Dorothy reached for a small wooden box on her bedside table. Inside was a simple metal thimble, worn smooth with age. "This belonged to Grandma Alice," she said, holding it carefully. After Miss Sullivan resigned and Samuel couldn't attend anymore, Grandma Alice went to Miss Sullivan's apartment to thank her. Miss Sullivan was packing, getting ready to leave teaching forever. Grandma Alice gave her this thimble, I was the only valuable thing she owned, as payment for the education Samuel had received. Miss Sullivan refused at first, but Grandma Alice insisted. She said, "You gave my grandson a future. This thimble is all I have to give in return." Tears rolled down Dorothy's cheeks. Grandpa Samuel told me that story when I was 10 years old. He said I must never forget that his education cost two women everything. James now had testimony from both sides, Patrick's family and Samuel's family. But he needed official documentation to make the story irrefutable. He returned to the Brooklyn Historical Society archives with renewed purpose, this time searching for any evidence that the school board investigation had been more thorough than the official report suggested. He found it in an unexpected place, personal correspondence between school board members that had been donated to the archive decades ago. Among the letters was an exchange between Edward Whitmore, the school board chairman, and a board member named Thomas Fletcher. The first letter, dated November 1895, was from Fletcher to Whitmore. Regarding the complaint about Miss Sullivan, I believe there may be truth to these allegations. My wife has a friend whose maid works on DeKalb Avenue and claims to have seen Miss Sullivan visiting a Negro family there. If this is confirmed, we must act swiftly. The law is clear, and we cannot afford the scandal. Whitmore's response was more measured. I agree we must investigate, but carefully. Miss Sullivan is an excellent teacher with an unblemished record. We must have proof before we accuse her of such serious violations. I will speak with her personally. There was a third letter, dated December 1895, from Whitmore to Fletcher. I met with Miss Sullivan today. She denied all allegations. I inspected her classroom and attendance records. Everything appears in order. However, I have advised her that continued rumors could damage the school's reputation and suggested she consider whether this position remains suitable for her. She seemed to understand my meaning. James understood immediately. Whitmore hadn't found proof because Margaret had hidden it well, but he'd made it clear she needed to leave. It was a forced resignation disguised as a voluntary departure. There was one more document, a brief note from Margaret Sullivan to the school board, dated February 1896. I hereby resign my position at Riverside Elementary School effective March 1st, 1896. Thank you for the opportunity to serve these students. I hope they will continue to receive the education they deserve, regardless of circumstances. The phrase, regardless of circumstances, felt deliberate. It was Margaret's final, subtle act of defiance. James sat back, the pieces falling into place. Margaret had known she was being pushed out. She'd known why, but she'd left on her own terms, with dignity, and without betraying Samuel or his grandmother. He thought about the photograph again, that carefully hidden arm, visible just enough to prove Samuel had been there. It wasn't an accident. It was Margaret's way of ensuring that someday someone would discover the truth. And now, 124 years later, someone finally had. James knew this story was bigger than an academic paper. It needed to reach people, to remind them of the quiet acts of resistance that had shaped history. He contacted the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, now published online, and pitched the story to their features editor. The editor, a woman named Rebecca Torres, was immediately interested. This is exactly the kind of local history people need to hear, she said. When can we run it? I want to do one more thing first, James replied. I want to bring the families together. He reached out to David Murphy in New Jersey and Dorothy Carter in Queens. He explained that he wanted to arrange a meeting where they could see the photograph together and share their families' stories. Both agreed immediately. They met on a sunny Saturday morning in May 2019 at the Brooklyn Historical Society. James had arranged for a private viewing room and had the original photograph professionally framed. He'd also printed enlarged versions showing the hidden arm clearly visible. David arrived first, accompanied by his wife and two adult children. Dorothy came with her son and granddaughter who pushed her wheelchair. The two families had never met before, though their ancestors had been friends more than a century earlier. James made introductions, and then he placed the photograph on the table. This image was taken on September 20th, 1895. He began. It shows the students and teacher of Riverside Elementary School, but it also shows something extraordinary, evidence of a secret friendship and an act of courage that changed at least two lives forever. He pointed to the partially hidden arm. This belongs to Samuel Carter, Dorothy's grandfather, and the boy whose shoulder he's touching is Patrick Murphy, David's great-grandfather. They were friends, brought together by a teacher named Margaret Sullivan who believed that education was a right, not a privilege determined by skin color. David and Dorothy leaned closer to the photograph, their families crowding around behind them. Dorothy reached out with a trembling hand and touched the glass covering the image. "That's my grandpa," she whispered. "I've heard stories my whole life, but I never knew there was proof. I never knew anyone had cared enough to remember." David placed his hand near Dorothy's on the glass. "Our great-grandfather told my grandmother that Samuel was the best friend he ever had. He said losing that friendship when they had to hide it from the world was one of the saddest things he ever experienced." "They didn't lose it," James said gently. He pulled out the 1896 photograph of the two boys standing together, arms around each other. They found ways to stay connected even when the world tried to keep them apart. Dorothy began to cry, and David's wife quietly offered her a tissue. The granddaughter standing behind Dorothy's wheelchair put her hands on the older woman's shoulders. "Miss Sullivan risked everything," Dorothy said, "and we never got to thank her properly." "Maybe we still can," James suggested. The story ran in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle on June 15, 2019 under the headline, "Hidden in Plain Sight, the 1895 school photo that reveals a secret act of resistance." It included the photograph, the testimonies from both families, and James's research documenting Margaret Sullivan's quiet defiance. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the article had been shared thousands of times on social media. News outlets across the country picked it up. CBS Evening News ran a segment. The New York Times published a feature. People were moved by the image of that small brown hand resting on Patrick's shoulder. Such a simple gesture, yet so powerful in its context. But what touched James most were the emails he received from teachers. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of educators wrote to say that Margaret Sullivan's story reminded them why they'd chosen their profession. One email came from a teacher in Alabama. "I teach in a district where I'm pressured to ignore certain students who don't speak English well. Your article reminded me that my job is to teach every child, no matter what anyone says. Margaret Sullivan is my hero." As the story spread, James received a call from the principal of the school that now occupied the site where Riverside Elementary once stood. "We'd like to do something to honor Margaret Sullivan in this story," she said. "Would you help us?" 3 months later, on September 20th, 2019, exactly 124 years after the original photograph was taken, a ceremony was held. The school had commissioned a bronze plaque to be installed at the entrance. It read, "In memory of Margaret Sullivan, teacher, 1893-1896. In defiance of unjust laws, she opened her classroom to all children, regardless of race. Her courage reminds us that education is a right, not a privilege, and that the smallest acts of resistance can echo through generations." Below the text was a reproduction of the 1895 photograph, with an arrow pointing to Samuel's partially visible arm. David Murphy and Dorothy Carter were both present, along with more than 30 of their combined descendants. The current students of the school, a diverse group of children from a dozen different backgrounds, performed songs and read essays about what education meant to them. Dorothy, now in a wheelchair but with clear eyes and a strong voice, addressed the crowd. "My grandfather Samuel became a teacher," she said. "He spent 40 years educating children in Harlem. He always said he owed everything to two people, his grandmother Alice, who sacrificed everything to give him a chance, and Miss Sullivan, who saw him as a student, not as a color. Today, we honor all three of them." David spoke next. "My great-grandfather Patrick taught his children that friendship has no color. He taught them that standing up for what's right sometimes means breaking rules that shouldn't exist. That lesson has been passed down through 4 generations of my family. Today, we make sure it continues." After the ceremony, James stood before the plaque with the two families. A young girl, Dorothy's great-great-granddaughter, looked up at the photograph. "Why did they have to hide him?" she asked. Dorothy took the child's hand. "Because people then believed wrong things. But Miss Sullivan knew better, and that's why we remember her." 6 months after the ceremony, James received an unexpected package at his office. It was from a woman named Helen Bradford in Connecticut, who identified herself as Margaret Sullivan's great-great-niece. Inside the package was a small leather journal, worn and faded, with Margaret's name embossed on the cover. A note from Helen explained, "This was found among my grandmother's belongings after she passed. My grandmother was Margaret Sullivan's niece. The family always knew Aunt Margaret had been a teacher, but we never knew the full story until we saw your article. I think this journal belongs in the historical record now." James opened the journal with careful hands. The entries were dated from 1893 to 1896, Margaret's years at Riverside Elementary. Most were mundane observations about teaching, but then he found the entries from 1894 and 1895. October 12th, 1894. "Today I met a remarkable child. His grandmother was teaching him to read on a park bench near the school. The boy's hunger for knowledge was evident in every question he asked. I find myself thinking about him tonight. How many brilliant minds are denied education simply because of the circumstances of their birth? It seems a waste, and worse, a sin." November 3rd, 1894. "I have made a decision that my brother would call reckless. I will teach the boy. Samuel is his name. His grandmother wept when I offered. I know the risks, but I cannot walk past this child and do nothing. If God gave me the gift of teaching, surely he meant for me to use it for all his children." April 20th, 1895. "Samuel is progressing wonderfully. He reads at a level beyond his years and shows particular aptitude for mathematics. I've also noticed something beautiful. Patrick, one of my struggling students, has formed a friendship with Samuel during our after-school sessions. They help each other with lessons. It is remarkable how naturally they connect when the poisonous ideas of adults are not forced upon them." September 18th, 1895. "Tomorrow is the school photograph. I have decided to include Samuel, though it must be done carefully. I cannot let him be completely erased from this record. If anyone ever examines this photograph closely, they will see the truth. He was here. He belonged. He learned. That small testimony may be all I can offer, but it is something." November 30th, 1895. "The school board has begun investigating the rumors. I have hidden all evidence of Samuel's attendance. His grandmother and I have agreed he cannot return. My heart breaks for both of them. I fear I will lose my position, but that seems a small price for doing what was right." February 28th, 1896. "I have resigned. It is better to leave on my own terms than to be dismissed in disgrace. I do not regret my choice. Samuel learned to read and write. He learned mathematics and history. For 2 years, he had the education every child deserves. If my career is the cost of that, it was worth paying. The final entry was dated March 15th, 1896. I saw Samuel and his grandmother today. Alice gave me a thimble that belonged to her mother. She said it was all she had to give. I tried to refuse, but she insisted. I will keep it always, not as payment, but as a reminder. I taught Samuel for 2 years, but Alice has fought for his future every day of his life. She is the true hero of this story. I pray Samuel will have the life he deserves, and that someday people will understand why some rules must be broken. James closed the journal, his vision blurred with tears. He thought about Margaret Sullivan, who had died in 1943, having never known that her secret would be discovered, her courage recognized, her defiance celebrated. He thought about Alice Carter, who had given everything for her grandson's education and had lived to see him become a teacher himself. He thought about Samuel, who had carried the gift of learning forward, teaching hundreds of children in Harlem for 4 decades. He thought about Patrick, who had learned at age 9 that friendship and justice mattered more than unjust laws. And he thought about that photograph, that simple school picture from 1895, which had held its secret for 124 years until someone finally looked closely enough to see what Margaret Sullivan had wanted the world to know. That one small brown hand resting on a friend's shoulder was proof that even in the darkest times, there were people who chose love over law, humanity over hate. The photograph now hung in the Brooklyn Historical Society, with Margaret's journal displayed beside it. Thousands of visitors came each year to see it. Students, teachers, families, historians. They read the story and looked at the image, their eyes finding that partially hidden arm, and they understood. Some acts of courage are loud and public. Others are quiet and hidden, visible only to those willing to look closely. But all of them echo forward through time, reminding us that one person's decision to do what's right can change the course of history. One student, one photograph, one small act of defiance at a time. Margaret Sullivan had made sure Samuel was in that photograph, and 124 years later, the world finally saw him.